Beyond 3D.
Good evening, good Saturday evening, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Beyond 3D. Matt and Clint here. Hopefully your week has been spectacular, just like ours. How are you, Clint?
Sorry I'm late.
Nah, you're not late.
I was detained by BT and Woody.
Whatever that means.
Well, we had to go visit Trina in his den of sin.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Gotcha.
No, I've got sunstroke. I'm delirious.
Gotcha, yeah.
I'm delirious.
That happens down here in Australia, especially when you're out in the sun. You can get sunstroke.
It was all day yesterday. I've gone through 2 bottles of aloe vera already.
Right.
And, you know, even though today was a cool day, it doesn't matter. I'm still delirious.
I get you. Well, guys, Delirious Clint and Matt here with you for this week's edition of Beyond 3D. Hopefully you've all done really well out there this past week. And we'll see what we can do for you this evening. See what kind of information we can get for you. And let's get right into it. And being that Clint mentioned sunstroke, heat stroke, all those kinds of things, why don't we start off with a lovely thing near and dear to our hearts here in the Pacific called Fukushima.
Oh, excuse me, I know I choked in the water. Mm-hmm. You know what? You and I don't ever talk about what we each look at during the week, do we?
Mm-hmm. No.
I was looking at that too.
Yeah. Interesting. The news that's come out?
Scary.
Yeah, the news that come out
interesting, it's really scary. Really, really scary.
Well, guys, when you look at the news, if you haven't heard anything about Fukushima this week, no, you weren't under a rock, you just haven't heard. The fact of the matter is, even the Japanese are now admitting that it is at disaster levels.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And there is a lovely little photo I'm going to put up on our Facebook page that I got from Secure Team. Just a lovely little picture of Google Earth, and with the plume of radiation that has entrenched parts of Japan and the Pacific Ocean heading towards the United States, heading east.
I saw a photo of a dolphin.
Ooh.
That had mutated its front fin. Mm-hmm. The size of a whale's tail. Like it's just its left one.
Yeah, it's not like, nice.
Well, I did say probably this time last year, season 2, that Fukushima was just heading towards California, about to poison its food belt, and that anything that swam through it, that ribbon of radiation, would either drop dead, or if it got near enough, it would be highly mutated. And the stuff that they're pulling out of the ocean is horrific at the moment. Yeah,
well, guys, let's a little background. 2011 Japanese earthquake, huge tsunami that followed, and it took out TEPCO's reactor at Fukushima and caused an absolute disaster over there. So from that point, 2011 till today, 2017, we're looking at... We talk about it here in Australia, the fact that the barrier reef is dying and has been poisoned in a sense. And that is partly because of this whole thing going on that happened up in Japan with Fukushima in 2011, which could accelerate what was going on back then. Contaminated Pacific Ocean, we're looking at. The levels right now coming out of the reactor are higher than the levels in 2011. That is interesting. And the other thing that was interesting was TEPCO sent in a robot to check the reactor for holes.
Go on.
How long did the robot last?
Go on.
Say it.
No, you say it.
You say it.
It's your story, my friend.
The robot was fried in an hour.
And that was built by who?
Robot was sent into the reactor. An Hitachi robot. The company Hitachi sent in a robot. Now this robot is supposed to last 10 hours in there, and it lasted 10% of the amount of time that it's supposed to last, which is telling you something is definitely amiss insofar as that is concerned. And then they're going to get into all the scientific gobbledygook, and you start talking about, different things like how many sieverts per hour, and those sieverts basically means 4 sieverts per hour can kill a human being.
Hang on.
Sieverts. Technical term. Radiation levels that are coming out and how much per hour comes out can have adverse effects on the human body. So if it's more than 4 Sieverts per hour. That is lethal to humans.
And the robot died in how many?
In 1 hour.
It's an artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and they measured the...
It doesn't have organs as fragile as ours.
Yeah, but they measured the Sieverts coming out of this thing.
We wouldn't stand seconds.
Yeah, well, according to this, it is coming out at 530 Sieverts per hour. So, yeah, you'd walk in basically and just go, and you'd be dead. So that's not very good.
Hats off, though.
Hats off?
Yeah.
Why, they're trying?
No, hats off to Masao Yoshida.
Mm-hmm. Is he still alive?
No, man, he's not still alive.
Oh, yeah, hats off.
He's the hero of Fukushima, the nuclear engineer who disobeyed orders to shut down the plant, and he flooded it with seawater. If they hadn't done that, the whole place would have gone sky high.
Fair enough. Now, a person like that deserves a hats off, considering what they've had to go through and the fact that they basically sacrificed themselves to save a whole lot of people.
Yep.
And when you consider Fukushima is a little bit north of Tokyo and there are 30 million people in Tokyo, ouch, that could have been very nasty, so to speak.
Well, we would have suffered a bit of that across the top end.
We would have. But the other thing we have to think about now, being that this is the disaster and they're finally starting to admit that it is a disaster, I now have to think about what is Premier or Prime Minister Abe actually talking about when he goes to the United States to talk to Trump.
As if Donald's going to care. So, Matt, I need to be punished.
Why?
I just said...
You said he who should not be named?
I did say he who shall not be named.
No, I'm thinking about it,
as if that bloated stuffed pig gives a damn about helping another nation in a disaster relief.
And the other thing I just thought about...
That's way down on his list. That's way down on his list.
The other thing I just thought about that you brought it up was this. This thing is moving toward California, but he's not a fan of California right now. Or Oregon, or Washington State, for that matter.
Well, hang on a second. California is part of the food belt.
California is a big part of the food belt. And a lot, especially the San Joaquin Valley in Central California, from Monterey going into Fresno, into Yosemite, that is a huge farm area. If you start getting radiation-style material into the food chain, and it's already involved in the sea, so seafood you can't really trust. All of a sudden, what happens to oranges, what happens to fruits, what happens to some vegetables, what happens to garlic, one of my favorites, and all that kind of stuff. Interesting.
I'll tell you what happens. Oh, I got to chill up my spine. I'll tell you what happens. When all of the plants are wiped out, guess who steps in to save the day with their genetically modified branded food?
Which ties into another...
Hello?
Yes, it does.
That just hit me like a bolt of lightning.
Yeah, but that
does that not just play out perfect?
Yeah, but that also ties into something which we will get into after this break.
No, is it? No.
Yeah.
No.
Beyond 3D.
Welcome back to this week's edition of Beyond 3D, guys. We were before the break discussing a certain company's name, Monsanto, maybe?
Yes.
Things like that could be
Bing,
taken.
bing, 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 bing.
Exactly. Now.
Hang on, I got to play their real thing. Donald shares it too.
What? Gotcha. There's another story that came out around this, and it's very interesting. We just mentioned
The evil food empire.
the evil food empire. There's also something going on one of your other favorite things, WikiLeaks.
Oh, hello.
Now, WikiLeaks has sent out some...
I am delirious tonight.
Yeah, WikiLeaks just sent out some very interesting, shall we say, tweets all about Vault 7.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Vault 7 is up in Norway.
I tell you what, that's where real estate around that area would be worth quite a bit, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but what does allegedly Vault 7 contain?
I need to drink of water for this. Hang on.
Go ahead.
So, Vault 7 is a giant bank in Norway.
Yep.
And it is nicknamed the Doomsday Seed Vault.
So Japan makes an announcement about Fukushima saying that the radiation is at disaster levels. You now get all of this stuff heading across the Pacific Ocean towards one of the major food belts of one country, at least the United States. It will also swing around and take care of Mexico and a few other countries in South America and just follow the trade winds and everything down there and just swing back around to Australia as well in a circle, clockwise. Now, if that is the case and all of a sudden you have a seed bank and you get WikiLeaks start making covert tweets about this seed bank up in Norway and what the heck is going on. What's it called? Svalbard or something like that up in Norway. I find that very interesting. The other thing you'd find interesting is that he who shall not be named a head of the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, who is against protecting the environment.
Bring it home.
So now you have a situation where you have...
Bring it home, Matt.
All these countries. You got Japan with a problem. All of a sudden the problem is in the United States, but the United States doesn't really care about it. And then all of a sudden you have people talking about the seed banks up in Norway, which keeps all of these seeds from around the world, all the different plants and all the different vegetables from around the world in a safe environment, and they're starting to talk about this as well. Who would be happy if, let's say, half of the population of the world would be wiped out by tainted food and tainted water supplies? The so-called elite that we always talk about. They would be in ecstasy. They would have they would be able to take absolute control over a lot of things out there because of this. So it's really interesting that all of this stuff is starting to come up right around the same amount of time when things are falling into place, and now you have a person in the United States, he who shall not be named, which is really acting wacky as well. So I find it very interesting, everything that's going on.
Can I, how much time have we got?
You got about 2 minutes.
No, okay.
Make it 3.
Oh, God, where do I go with this? Okay. All right. Matthew.
Yes.
What caused Fukushima?
Well, it's very interesting. You were asking a question. Very interesting. Now, Fukushima was an earthquake. Earthquakes.
Yes, Matthew.
We're going to have to take another little bit of a break. And we're going to come back and we're going to discuss.
No, you said we had 2 minutes.
Oh, okay, then we can start discussing it. I'll let you start it off because you're going to say something.
No. I'm loving this. Go.
And I have something here written down that I was looking at this week about that. And I just have to find it here. I just want to make sure I read it properly. Yes, I look at that page and I go, no, I want the other page. And then I'm going to go up to this one.
I'm like a kid at Christmas sitting here watching the last present come around.
Where are you? There you are.
Is that what it was like? Is that what it was like?
No. Second page. Matthew. Wait a second.
Christmas. Is that what it was like?
Yeah, maybe. Now that's really weird.
I wish.
We are trying all this stuff together, and we left out one important part, and the question was from Clint. What caused Fukushima? Fukushima was caused by an earthquake.
Yes.
Therefore, what did I write down in my little notes here? And what I wrote down in my notes, I will now read to you. Let me just bring it up. Oh. There it is.
Oh, don't make me open a video game.
Here comes the answer right here. Haarp reopens in 2017 under new ownership.
Yes.
No longer the Air Force, now it is the University of Alaska at Fairbanks.
But prior, it was owned by who?
United States Air Force.
When the Fukushima went off?
Yes. Interesting. Quite interesting indeed. We will be back in a moment.
Beyond 3D.
Imagine the Earth's atmosphere, also known as the ionosphere, as a thick soap bubble. It is a membrane, a natural electrically charged shield around the Earth, protecting all life from deadly solar radiation.
We have to have the atmosphere for survival. I don't think we should do anything to damage it.
Without the ionosphere, I'd be fried, you'd be fried, all life on Earth would be fried.
In 1912, Nikola Tesla, a visionary genius, saw ways to tame the sky, to make the atmosphere glow. He developed alternating current, high-frequency radio technology, and free energy. He experimented with both high and low frequencies and electromagnetic waves. He envisioned altering the weather and creating shields around the Earth to protect us from missiles, and he claimed he knew how to split the Earth in two. In 1985, Bernard Eastlund applied for patents that could make some of these ideas real. Many claim that these patents have become the blueprint for Haarp, High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program.
ARCO originally approached me in 1984 to find a use for the natural gas on the North Slope of Alaska, which they could not sell. To give you a feel for how much gas they asked me to find an application for, it was enough gas to produce all the electricity in the United States for a full year. I originated some ideas for military applications and beneficial civilian applications in which that gas would be converted into electricity and then used to power some gigantic antennas.
What does Haarp do? Haarp is a large antenna where we beam radio frequency energy up into the upper atmosphere, and we create on a small scale what the sun normally does. And the reason we're trying to do this is because when you have disturbances in the ionosphere, we can't communicate with our satellites.
Haarp began with a congressional insertion in the appropriations bill of fiscal year 1990. In essence, Congress directed the Defense Department to explore the potential for using the auroral regions for improving communications and navigation and surveillance. From there, the assignment came that the Navy and the Air Force were to manage the program. It is people from those two organizations that have worked together for the past 7 years.
Applications discussed in the patents included destroying missiles. Communications control and disruption were included. There were some other ideas both to possibly modify weather and finally to lift a portion of the upper atmosphere further out into space where hopefully it would be able to deflect missile trajectories.
What we do by beaming up radio frequency up into the ionosphere, that radio frequency, when it hits molecules of atmosphere, it tends to make the subatomic particles inside move faster, and that increases their temperature. So you can bring their temperature up to 1,600 degrees or so, which is normally what the sun does to those particles at that atmosphere.
The ionosphere of the Earth has got enormous amount of energy. There are 8,000 thunderstorms going on all over the Earth at any given moment. There are millions of amperes of electricity pouring to the Earth from lightning strikes. And Haarp could create a trigger effect.
In 1983, I did radio tomography with 30 watts, looking for oil in the ground. I found 26 oil wells over a 9-state area, and 100% of the time was accurate with just 30 watts of power beaming straight into solid rock. Haarp uses 1 billion watts beamed straight into the ionosphere for experiments. Picture these strings on the piano as layers of the Earth. Each one has its own frequency. What we used to do is beam radio waves into the ground, and it would vibrate any strings that were present in the ground. We might get a sound back like, and we'd say, that's natural gas. We might get a sound back like, and we'd say, that's crude oil. We were able to identify each frequency. We accomplished this with just 30 watts of radio power. If you do this with 1 billion watts, the vibrations are so violent that the entire piano would shake. In fact, the whole house would shake. In fact, the vibrations could be so severe underground that could even cause an earthquake. Beyond 3D.
Well, for many, many years now, I've been ticking off the ever-increasing sources of radiation to which humans are subjected. And they are so numerous and being added to all the time. It was very clear to me that there is an agenda here of subjecting humanity to more and more radiation. It's a long story and many, many elements to why, but the fact that they're doing it is becoming obvious. And so when the explosions at Fukushima happened in Japan, from my perspective, having looked at this over a number of years, it was just too much of a gift to this cabal, given the scale, the stunning scale of radiation that not only was released immediately, but has gone on being released ever since. And, you know, there's reports recently out of Europe of finding these high levels of radiation, and it's like, where's it coming from? Well, there's a very good chance of where it's coming from, because Fukushima has been pouring this stuff out incessantly, day after day after day. So I started looking into it, and one of the first things I noticed, and other people started looking at this as well, was that the explosion that was captured on video of one of the reactors exploding in Fukushima, and the explosion, the smoke stack of a small nuclear device were extraordinarily similar. So I then started looking at anything that could have explained this, and I came across the fact that in the years leading up to Fukushima, those reactors and that site in general had installed a new surveillance camera and sensor system with these this technology put into the reactors and other parts of the site. And when you look at it, you know today that technology is getting ever lighter, it's getting ever smaller, and yet when you looked at these cameras and sensors that were installed into Fukushima in the months before this happened, they were like ludicrous. You know, you get these little tiny kind of mobile phones now, and yet when mobile phones started, they were about that big, and you're as old as your ear with two hands, you know. Well, that was the kind of difference between the kind of surveillance technology you see normally now and these things. They weighed 1,000 pounds. And then when you put one of those next to what they call a gun-type nuclear weapon, which is a small nuclear device. If you take the casing off the gun-type nuclear weapon, what is inside is, shall we say, not a million miles from what these cameras and sensors look like. And it was, you know, with other information, it was my view, I concluded, that these were small nuclear devices and that Fukushima was blown up on purpose to release that radiation as part of this much wider radiation agenda to irradiate the atmosphere of the planet much more than it has been up to this point. And then I asked the question, who put these devices in, these sensors in? And it turns out to be an Israeli company located at Dimona in Israel. And Dimona is the location of the massive Israeli nuclear weapons program. And I can tell you from 22 years of research, there is no such thing as an Israeli security company that is not a front for Mossad. It's not allowed. And then there was a man called Arnie Gunderson, who's a nuclear engineer, and he made a speech in Boston, and it was almost like an alert. It was like, hey, we found something about Fukushima which should not have happened, and this has great implications for containment design and nuclear design. And what he'd found from the footage is that the explosions at Fukushima moved so fast that they passed the speed of sound and entered the realm of what is known as a detonation wave. And as he pointed out, a nuclear explosion at a nuclear plant like that should never ever become a detonation wave. It produces what they call a deflagration wave, which is below the speed of sound. And his alert was, hey, we had no idea this was possible. He says, I've talked to a bunch of chemists and we can't work out how it is possible for a nuclear explosion at a plant like that to cause a detonation wave. Well, maybe it wasn't a nuclear explosion of that kind that caused the detonation wave, but a device designed to detonate. And it is my strong view that Fukushima was blown up on purpose to release this stunning level of radiation. And then, of course, the question comes, okay, so you're saying they put these things in and blew it up, and then they just sit around strumming their fingers, hoping that some kind of earthquake and tsunami comes along as cover for it. Well, no. Which is when we come to what you just mentioned, Haarp. And Haarp relates to a man very well known in this area of the world, Nicola Tesla. Nicola Tesla was the scientific genius of the 20th century, and if he was alive today, he'd be the scientific genius probably of the first part of the 21st century. He had understood many things about the nature of our reality. He'd understood about the electromagnetic fields that you can access and turn into usable warmth and power, which the cabal that owns the energy industry of the world has been suppressing because it doesn't want people to have access to this free energy, which we could have. And by the way, the same people who are saying we must lower carbon emissions because of global warming, which is another nonsense, this human-caused global warming lie, they're the same people that are suppressing the development of use of free energy technology, which Tesla developed and understood, which could eliminate the carbon power systems, immediately. So it's all a lie. But what Haarp does is it fires radio waves, very, very focused and very powerful, into the upper atmosphere known as the ionosphere, and it entrains, as they say. It gets the ionosphere to vibrate in sympathy with the radio wave, and this creates a situation where this entrainment adds massive, massive, massive power to the original radio wave, and then it's bounced back to Earth, massively greater power. And they can hit a specific spot on the Earth. And if they can hit somewhere which is vulnerable in terms of earthquakes anyway, and they can do it at a specific frequency, because earthquakes have a frequency like everything does, then they can cause an earthquake and they can cause a tsunami. And they can cause, with the same principle, they can cause very great extremes of weather, like hundreds of unprecedented tornadoes that appeared in 2007 and killed hundreds of people in America. And people say, oh no, you can't mess with the weather, it's ridiculous. Well, hold on a second, there are international treaties which countries have signed saying that it's illegal to manipulate the weather and to use it as a weapon of war. Well, they're not going to have those treaties unless they know it's possible. It's ridiculous. And so we have a situation where, yes, of course there are natural earthquakes, but they don't all have to be. And you can bomb somewhere from an aircraft, or you can cause devastating earthquakes and devastating weather events, and you can bring the countries to their knees that way. And in many ways, people within countries, many of them anyway, within the establishment, they know that Fukushima and that earthquake and tsunami and everything, they know it was created. It wasn't a natural event. And what that says to them, and what they're saying to them with that event is, if you say no to us, look what we can do. If they want to bring Japan to its knees, they've got to find a way, like they did in with the two, Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. But today they would have to find an excuse to send the boys in. Well, they can't find an excuse. So instead of that, we'll go the way that they have, because Japan is over. It's over. The amount of radiation that has been released into the Earth's atmosphere is potentially catastrophic. The amount that's been released in the immediate area around Japan and the wider Japan is unthinkably catastrophic. And people are already starting to go down with the effects of it, and we've seen nothing yet. This was you have these James Bond movies written by a British intelligence agent, by the way, where you have the guy on the island with the fantastic technology, or the guy with the satellite in the sky that can, cause devastation on Earth, and he holds the world to ransom on the basis of I won't use it only if you do this. Blackmail. Well, this is what's happening in the real world because of this technology that they have. And, Tesla, in an interview with the New York Times in the 1940s, I think it was, maybe a bit earlier, he said that he had the technology to split the Earth in half. Then he was producing lightning around his home in New York. The neighbors were calling the police. He was causing kind of mini earthquakes, getting the earth to shake because of the technology he had, and thousands of windows were breaking before he could switch it off. And Bernard Eastland, the man who applied, first of all, for the patent for the technology that is used in Haarp, based in Alaska, but there's connecting technology all around the world. That's just the main focal point. He mentions Tesla when he's applying for the patent. It's Tesla technology. And if Tesla could, do that devastation he said he could do back in the 1930s and 40s, what the heck can they do now? So instead of, it's not really a case of, what do you mean they can cause earthquakes? That's crazy. No. Causing earthquakes is a piece of cake for this technology. And thus, you have a situation in 2010 when in the run-up to it, in the years running up to 2010 around Haiti, it was established that there were major resources under the sea in Haiti waters. In 2010, this devastating earthquake brings the end to Haiti. It just so happened, that the American military were having an exercise at exactly the same time that was based on a scenario of reacting to, I think it was a hurricane or something like that, hitting Haiti. And they were down in Florida doing their exercise. And then the earthquake happened and they said, we just switched from exercise to real thing. And they were in there in no time. And if you remember, the aid agencies that were trying to land in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, they were saying, in the immediate days after the earthquake, the American military have taken over the airport, so they're not letting us in. They took the place over. And then along came Clinton and Boyd Bush as the people that were going to front up the Haiti Reconstruction Fund, and then they disappeared, and Haiti, virtually nothing's been done, because the idea was to destroy Haiti, take it over, because then you've got the resources. And you can do that with an earthquake. How are they going to justify destroying Haiti by dropping bombs on it? I mean, they're not going to do it. But you can do it through Haarp and earthquakes. And the weather wars and the geological wars are not some science fiction fantasy. They're happening now.
Beyond 3D.
To discuss the situation in Japan, as well as his latest book, we're joined by Dr. Michio Kaku. a Japanese-American physicist, a best-selling author, professor of theoretical physics at City University of New York and the City College of New York. His brand new book is Physics of the Future: How Science Will Change Daily Life by 2100. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to see you again.
Glad to be on the show, Amy.
So, talk about this raising of the category level to 7 on a par with Chernobyl.
Well, Tokyo Electric has been in denial, trying to downplay the full impact of this nuclear accident. However, there's a formula, a mathematical formula by which you can determine what level this accident is. This accident has already released something on the order of 50,000 trillion becquerels of radiation. You do the math. That puts it right smack in the middle of a level 7 nuclear accident. Still less than Chernobyl. However, radiation is continuing to leak out of the reactors. The situation is not stable at all. So you're looking at basically a ticking time bomb. It appears stable, but the slightest disturbance, a secondary earthquake, a pipe break, evacuation of the crew at Fukushima could set off a full-scale meltdown at 3 nuclear power stations, far beyond what we saw at Chernobyl.
Talk about exactly, as a physicist, to explain to people exactly what has taken place in Japan at these nuclear power plants.
Say you're driving a car, and the car all of a sudden lunges out of control. You hit the brakes don't work. That's because the earthquake wiped out the safety systems in the first minute of the earthquake and tsunami. Then your radiator starts to heat up and explodes. That's the hydrogen gas explosion. And then to make it worse, the gas tank is heating up, and all of a sudden your whole car is going to be in flames. That's the full-scale meltdown. So what do? You drive the car into a river. That's what the utility did by putting seawater from the Pacific Ocean in a desperate attempt to keep water on top of the core. But then seawater has salt in it, and that gums up your radiator. And so what do? You call out the local firemen. And so now you have these Japanese samurai warriors. They know that this is potentially a suicide mission. They're coming in with hose water, trying to keep water over the melted nuclear reactor cores. So that's the situation now. So when the utility says that things are stable, it's only stable in the sense that you're dangling from a cliff, hanging by your fingernails, and as the time goes by, each fingernail starts to crack. That's the situation now.
What about the food? The level of contamination of the food? They're increasingly banning food exports.
The tragedy is this accident has released enormous quantities of iodine, radioactive iodine-131, into the atmosphere, like what happened at Chernobyl, about 10% the level of Chernobyl. Iodine is water-soluble. When it rains, it gets into the soil. Cows then eat the vegetation, create milk, and then it winds up in the milk. Farmers are now dumping milk right on their farms because it's too radioactive. Foods have to be impounded in the area. And let's be blunt about this. Would you buy food that says made in Chernobyl? And the Japanese people are also saying, what should I buy food that says made in Fukushima? We're talking about the collapse of the local economy. Just because the government tries to lowball all the numbers, downplay the severity of the accident, and that's making it much worse.
What do you think has to be done now? One of the biggest problems is secrecy, both with the Tokyo company that runs the plants and also the government, the constant downplaying from the beginning. And yet there are so many people who've been evacuated who are demanding compensation. There was just a major protest at TEPCO with the people in the area who've been evacuated, no jobs, no money, saying we demand compensation.
Well, TEPCO is like the little Dutch boy. All of a sudden we have cracks in the dike. You put a finger here, you put a finger there, and all of a sudden new leaks start to occur, and they're overwhelmed. I suggest that they be removed from leadership entirely and be put as consultants. An international team of top physicists and engineers should take over with the authority to use the Japanese military. I think the Japanese military is the only organization capable of bringing this raging accident under control, and that's what Gorbachev did in 1986. He saw this flaming raging nuclear power station in Chernobyl, he called out the Red Air Force. He called out helicopters, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and buried the Chernobyl reactor in 5,000 tons of cement, sand, and boric acid. That's, of course, a last-ditch effort, but I think the Japanese military should be called out.
To do?
Because of the fact that the radiation levels are so great, workers can only go in for perhaps 10 minutes, 15 minutes at a time, and they get their year's dose of radiation. You're there for 1 hour, and you have radiation sickness. You vomit, your white corpuscle count goes down, your hair falls out. You're there for a day, and you get a lethal amount of radiation. At Chernobyl, there were 600,000 people mobilized, each one going in for just a few minutes, dumping sand, concrete, boric acid onto the reactor site. Each one got a medal. That's what it took to bring one raging nuclear accident under control. And I think the utility here is simply outclassed and overwhelmed.
And yet these workers are in for much longer periods of time.
That's right. We don't even know how much radiation levels they're getting because many areas around the site have no monitors. So we don't even know how much radiation many of these workers are getting. And that's why I'm saying if you have access to the military, you can have the option of sandbagging the reactor, encasing it in concrete, or at least have a reserve of troops that can go in for brief periods of time and bring this monster under control.
What about the evacuation zone? Is it big enough?
It's pathetic. The United States government has already stated 50 miles for evacuating U.S. personnel. The French government has stated that all French people should consider leaving the entire islands. And here we are with the government talking about 6 miles, 10 miles, 12 miles. And the people there are wondering, what's going on with the government? I mean, why aren't they telling us the truth? Radiation levels are now rising 25 miles from the site, far beyond the evacuation zone. And remember that we could see an increase in leukemia, we could see an increase in thyroid cancers. That's the inevitable consequence of releasing enormous quantities of iodine into the environment.
What has to happen to the plant ultimately?
Well, in the best case scenario, this is the scenario devised by the utility itself. They hope to bring it under control by the end of this year. By the end of this year, they hope to have the pumps working and the reaction is finally stabilized by the end of this year.
Oddly, it's sounding a little bit like BP when they were trying to plug up the hole.
Right.
It will happen, it will happen.
They're literally making it up as they go along. We're in totally uncharted territories. You get any nuclear engineering book, look at the last chapter, and this scenario is not contained in the last chapter of any nuclear engineering textbook on the planet Earth. So they're making it up as they go along. And we are the guinea pigs for this science experiment that's taking place. Then it could take up to 10 years to finally dismantle the reactor. The last stage is entombment. This is now the official recommendation of Toshiba that they entomb the reactor over a period of many years, similar to what happened in Chernobyl.
Entomb it in
a gigantic slab of concrete. You're going to have to drill underneath to make sure that the core does not melt right into the ground table. And you're going to put 5,000 tons of concrete and sand on top of the flaming reactor.
Should people be concerned about any food that says from Japan?
Not from Japan, but remember in the area, the sea, we're talking about levels that are millions of times beyond legal levels found right there. However, as you start to get out further, radiation levels drop rather considerably.
I wanted to talk about policy in this country. I mean, we are now seeing happening in Japan this horrific event. Japan was the target of the dawn of the nuclear age, right? The U.S. dropping of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Your own family mirrors the history of the nuclear age. Can you talk just briefly about that before we talk about current U.S. policy?
Yeah, first of all, I have relatives in Tokyo, and they're wondering about evacuation. In fact, some of my relatives have already evacuated from Tokyo. They have little children, and radiation has already appeared in the drinking water in Tokyo. And so people are wondering, you know, especially for young children, for pregnant women, should they leave? People are voting with their feet now. A lot of people are voluntarily evacuating from Tokyo because they simply don't believe the statements of the utility, which have consistently lowballed all the estimates of radiation damage.
Tokyo has announced plans to dump nearly 12,000 tons of radioactive water from the Fukushima plant.
Is it really as harmless as the government is making out? absolutely not. And any other normal circumstances, the release of such volumes of water would be described as catastrophic.
There's no concept how to store the radioactive fuel. Plutonium, if it is ingested by a human body, almost certainly leads to the development of cancer. Plutonium is a very, very dangerous and harmful substance which will radiate for many, many, many thousands of years.
Unsuccessfully trying to restore the cooling system at the facility in what is now the worst atomic crisis since Chernobyl.
Plutonium, if it is ingested by a human body, almost certainly leads to the development of cancer.
Right now we've got Paul Joseph Watson on, and we've been talking about the article that just went up on Drudge Report, our article that you wrote, Paul, 1,400% radiation hotspot found on the San Francisco beach. Their first reading, there was 10 times normal. Now, you also broke a story about 14 million dosages of potassium iodide being ordered by the government, and they want it in just 30 days. That was kind of an interesting finding.
Yeah, they're on it before the end of February.
That's right.
People have questioned that because, US public health authorities have been caught lying on a regular basis for decades and decades. And you can go back to atomic soldiers, you can go back to the EPA in the weeks after 9/11 saying that the asbestos-laden air was safe to breathe, which led to, 20,000 people getting debilitating illnesses, many dying. That's why people don't trust the government in terms of public health crises, because they've been caught lying on many occasions.
Paul, talking about this particular case here that you've got with the article, one of the things that really stuck out to me about it is that whether or not it's radiation from Fukushima or whether or not it's a concentration, as they point out, of radium and thorium, it's still dangerous if it's in a high concentration like that. And we were just talking about how the government is not interested in investigating this. When they went out and looked at the first reports of a 500% increase, the local government official said, well, it was probably just some red-painted disposable eating utensils. That was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Do you have any idea if he was being sarcastic or laughing about that? What's the context of that?
From my reading of it, it appeared as if he was being serious, but now they're saying the guy who designed the Geiger counters, the big company owner, is saying that this is dangerous to babies and young children. So the local government initially dismissed it. Now they're saying it could be dangerous. But a very important article for people to go and read is called "The Ocean is Broken." It came out of the Newcastle Herald, and this was about a yachtsman named Ivan McFadden. And basically he sailed from Japan all the way to San Francisco. It's from a guy who's seen it with his own eyes. He was in the same area 10 years before, only had to throw his net in the sea to get a ton of fish. He went back there, sailed from Osaka to San Francisco, and this is what he said. This was after Fukushima. He sailed in April last year. He said, "After we left Japan, it felt as if the ocean itself was dead. We hardly saw any living things. We saw one whale sort of rolling helplessly on the surface with what looked like a big tumor on its head. It was pretty sickening." Quote, "I've done lots of miles on the ocean in my life, and I'm used to seeing turtles, dolphins, sharks, big flurries of feeding birds, but this time for 3,000 nautical miles, there was nothing alive to be seen." And he concludes by saying, "The ocean is broken." Basically said the only thing he saw was piles of debris from the tsunami, bits of cars, bits of houses. All the ocean life, all the way from Japan to San Francisco, was basically dead for 3,000 nautical miles.
Wow, and that kind of correlates with what we saw in that report from some readings that were taken by the Monterey Maritime Institute there, and was published in the National Academy of Sciences, saying that at one particular station, they saw an increase in dead sea creatures on the ocean floor from 1% to 98% coverage of the floor. And they said that there were other stations that were giving them similar readings. It was the highest readings that they had seen, the highest coverage of dead sea life that they had seen in 24 years of observation. Now, they were saying it was global warming, although global warming isn't happening. It's not just that we're having a cold winter right now. This is a 17-year trend. We're not talking about one event of an extremely cold, record-breaking winter in North America. We're talking about 17 years of data that does not support global warming, and yet if the observations that they have there, everything has to be tied back to global warming because that's where they get their research grants, that's where they get their funding. And so they push back on that, but nobody is really looking at why this is happening, and they're not looking at the plausibility that this is radioactive material that's been leaked out in massive quantities from Fukushima now, coming up almost to 3 years in just a couple of months that this has been going on. You would expect that to have some effect, and that's apparently what this guy is observing as he goes across the Pacific Ocean.
Well, and part of the reason is that the fish eat plankton, don't they? And all the studies from around Hawaii and other areas, Canada as well, have shown that the fish have got abnormally very high levels of cesium-137, which is from the reactors in Fukushima. They did a study of the fish that Japan was selling to Canada and found that 90% and up of most of the fish had very high percentages of cesium-137 in their system, and this was around about a year ago now. So the fish are eating all that plankton, which is poisoned by this cesium-137, and then people who venture across the ocean say that there's nothing there, it's all dead. Then you get reports which you just mentioned about, in certain areas 98% of the sea life is dead. You've got reports of starfishes melting, sea lion cubs dying in unusual numbers. Even in Utah, you've got bald eagles dying that some people are linking to Fukushima. So there's a mass die-off of sea life, but again, government says nothing to worry about, move along, nothing to see here, just as they did after 9/11 with the EPA saying, the air was safe to breathe.
If it's their agenda, they've got an agenda that they want to push, and they're not interested in looking at anything that falls outside of that agenda, and they're not interested in looking at anything that affects the health of the public either.
Well, in their eyes, they would say we don't want to cause panic, but that's proven very dangerous in the past. It's killed people. I mean, the EPA immediately after Fukushima turned off most of their radiation detectors. They raised the safe level of radiation, certain types of it, by 100,000 times.
But it isn't just that they don't want to panic the public, because they do want to panic the public when it suits their purposes. You've got the EPA going before congressional testimony saying that particulate matter is the leading cause of death, that it's higher than cancer even, and then turning around a few months later and exposing people to levels that the EPA says are 70 to 80 times levels that the EPA said were safe levels. So they will deliberately try to create a panic. They'll try to create a panic with their testimony, then they'll even expose people to dangerous levels of something in order to create further panic. So there's a different agenda that's going on here.
Well, they choose which issues to create panic around, don't they? Yeah. If there's an opportunity to centralize power and to make a ton of money, then they're going to create panic around it. I mean, look at global warming, look at terrorism. If it's in their interest, they will create the panic. Then if you've got a real threat, they will say, we don't want to create a panic, let's downplay it. And It's a genuine threat.
Yeah, people should be concerned about that, because you know what? Radiation is radiation. We have, just to say that it's radium, radium is still dangerous. Red hot gas can increase the risk of lung cancer as well. And we have had a report from Kelly Blackwood that up in McClellan Air Force Base, which they decommissioned just outside of Sacramento, they had a huge amount of radium that they had used for illuminated dials in aircraft instruments, and it was leftover material. They had this massive mound of dirt. And the local government there in Sacramento, as well as the state government, said, you can't just leave that here. It's going to leach into the ground. It's going to get into groundwater. And they were pushing back on that. The Air Force didn't want to pay to move that. And eventually they just buried it there. Well, see, that's just the thing. I mean, when people go out and they take these readings and they get really high readings, the government's not really interested. And just as we saw at McClellan Air Force Base, sometimes it's the government themselves that's putting the radioactive material out there. Whether it's cesium-137 from Fukushima, or whether it's radium from an Air Force Base where they were using it in paint, still, radiation is dangerous in large amounts. It accumulates, but it's cumulative. And when you see these kinds of increases, first of all, the government really ought to be concerned about it. But if the government's not going to be concerned about it, the people need to understand what's going on about it. And ultimately, just like fluoride, where you have to take care of yourself, you have to get a fluoride filter, you also need to be aware of how to protect yourself from this with something like Survival Shield, getting a good source of clean, pure iodine like that. And that's really, ultimately, you're responsible for yourself. You're responsible for educating yourself, and you're responsible for taking the measurements to protect yourself and your family.
Beyond 3D. Welcome back tonight to Beyond 3D, and there you go, Matt. Some general information on Haarp. I think we had Michio Kaku there on Fukushima, a little bit of David Icke on Haarp again, and some information, interesting information from Paul Joseph Watson, courtesy on California's radiation, and that is a mess in itself at the moment. I had all that audio pre-prepared tonight, Matt. I didn't run it by you to play it tonight, but you know what I always say.
Okay.
Quick. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness.
Forgiveness, very good.
Anyway, no more Fukushima and Haarp tonight. Welcome back to tonight's edition of Beyond BT. Not BT. I said that because you kept me late tonight, my friend. You kept me late tonight, my friend. Go for it, Matt. Let's go.
Here's what's happening real quick. A few news items that I thought were of interest. Oprah Winfrey has now become an art dealer. She bought a lovely little Austrian painting back in 2006 for a cool $88 million and sold it to some Chinese person for a cool $150 million.
Guess what? She can do what she likes. That's her business.
Yeah, but it's interesting. She's now into the art world and dealing, and that's only 7% return on your money, but it's pretty good. Pretty good indeed. What else is going on?
Hang on. We're talking about an intrinsic market. So the value is only dictated by the amount of copies that there are with the amount of people that want it.
But when it comes to the art world right now, what you're getting is a situation, especially in China. Chinese always know, as long as the Communist Party is in control, they could nationalize everything, and a lot of things could be lost. So if you've made a lot of money...
Look out.
If you've made a lot of money,
Look out.
What you're going to do is you're going to start buying stuff, and you're going to have it in stuff, and that stuff can be outside of the country, and therefore you get to keep the money. That's what matters.
If I've got in my hand the last pen, right?
Yeah.
And you really need this pen, and everybody else really needs this pen, how much would you pay for it?
I don't know.
See, that's the thing. It's an intrinsic market. Just depends on what you're willing to pay for it.
Well, I can always say the intrinsic value of that pen is zero and wait till you die, but
exactly.
That's the whole point.
Actually, it's negative zero because of the energy it was wasted to create it.
Fair enough.
True or not?
Yeah, I can agree with that, but the other thing we have to get into, and I'll leave it at this, and then we have to talk about this a little bit next week. We actually have 2 moons.
Yes, we do.
A little one.
No, take that back. I'm going to take that back.
What?
We only have 1 moon.
Yeah.
And they just discovered it the other day. The other one I will refer to as a satellite.
That is a very good way of looking at it.
Thank you.
That is very good. No,
Thank
I
you.
like that.
Clap me.
Absolutely.
Mate,
that was very good.
I should be delirious. I should be delirious more.
Yes, I tell you what.
I'm humming with the universe tonight, baby.
I will tell you what, they found the normal moon that should be circling the Earth, and the other one somebody put there.
Yes, it's a satellite.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes. So,
I really like that.
So what's going to come next? Here's your real moon. Ta-da! New moon.
Interesting.
And it's actually, I don't think from memory, its orbit's further than the one we currently have.
I'll get all the details for
Here's
that next week.
Here's a question, why has nobody ever seen it?
We'll have to get into that as well.
Why has NASA never seen this new moon?
Well, they've seen it now.
No, maybe they've seen it for a long time.
They've just announced it now.
Interesting. Drip feed.
Interesting.
Drip feed.
Guys, done.
You know what I've just thought? Guess what I just thought of?
What?
We need to thank two very special people.
Last week, a good friend of ours made sure that this show got to air, and his name is Steve Meyers, and he was down at the Short Film Festival in Rosebud.
I'm contemplating entering next year.
We can talk about that another time.
What?
But at this point in time, we would like to thank Steve and Patricia for making sure that Beyond 3D got to air last week. It is greatly, greatly appreciated.
Yes, thank you guys.
Indeed. We have to get out of here. It's been a busy week for us, and I know it's been a busy week for you, so thanks for listening in this Saturday evening. We will catch you next week. No, we won't catch him next week?
No, we'll catch him next week. I've just realised how quick tonight's gone.
Yes, it's gone real quick. It's very quick.
All right.
A little too quick. Yeah?
I'm hungry.
I hear you.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Good night, people. Thank you so much. Can someone just for the weekend jack me back into the Matrix, please?
Take care. We'll catch you next week with another edition of Beyond 3D.
At last. Welcome, Neo. As you no doubt have guessed, I am Morpheus.
It's an honor to meet you.
No. The honor is mine. Please, come, sit. I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole?
You could say that.
I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate, Neo?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
Just because you haven't experienced it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist.